Hannibal Barca, facing Rome during the Second Punic War, took 70,000 soldiers, 20,000 horses and 37 elephants and forced them over the snowbound Alps. The campaign did not begin with a battle, it began with an impossible road. In 218 BCE, a Carthaginian army that could not challenge Rome at sea chose to cross Europe's highest mountains. Rome expected a naval landing. Hannibal chose a route that seemed suicidal. Why would a commander drag an entire army through frozen passes? Why did this audacious move succeed when doctrine said it should fail? What did Hannibal see that Rome's generals did not? These questions are not rhetorical hooks, they cut to the heart of strategy. Because this was not simply a march. It was a calculated break from everything a military academy teaches about logistics, morale, and risk. The strategic puzzle is stark. Unable to contest the Mediterranean, Carthage had to find another path into Italy. Hannibal could have attacked along the Iberian coast or waited for Rome to come. Instead, he decided to turn the Alps from an obstacle into a weapon. By appearing where Rome did not expect, he hoped to shatter Italian alliances and gain Gaulish support. This was a violation of every conventional norm. The Alps were considered impassable for large armies, winter crossings were madness. An ordinary commander would never bet his entire force on a 16-day march through avalanche-prone terrain without a secure supply line. Hannibal did, because he believed the psychological shock and political dividends outweighed the risk of annihilation. That decision defines the heart of this episode. We are not here to recite a timeline. We are here to decode why a commander would deliberately enter a corridor of ice and enemy ambushes, examine the assumptions he broke, and ask what it cost. The next sections will build a map of the strategic situation, show how conventional wisdom trapped Rome, and reveal how one man turned a mountain chain into his ally. What were the constraints that made such a desperate gambit even thinkable? The players were clear. Carthage, once the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean, had ceded control of the sea to Rome after the First Punic War. Rome, meanwhile, had expanded its Italian alliance system into a confederation that supplied men and resources on command. Hannibal's goal was not a raid but the strategic relocation of the war. He needed to force Rome to fight on its own soil, disrupt its alliance network and draw support from the disaffected tribes in northern Italy and Gaul. Rome's objective was to contain Carthage's ambitions, secure its trade routes and prevent a Carthaginian return to the Italian peninsula. Behind these high-level aims were layers of constraint. Geography defined the chessboard. Hannibal had to move his army from Iberia to Italy. The direct land route ran along the Mediterranean coast, but Roman allies controlled the coastal roads and fleets patrolled the sea. The inland route required crossing the Pyrenees, the Rhône, and then the Alps. The Pyrenees could be negotiated, the Rhône presented a river obstacle and hostile tribes, the Alps, rising into the clouds and covered in snow even in summer, were regarded as a barrier beyond strategy. Rome assumed that no army would choose that path. This assumption created a blind spot. Because the Alps were labeled impassable, they did not factor into Roman contingency plans. By the time Rome recognized the threat, Hannibal was already in the Po Valley. Logistics were another constraint. Hannibal commanded tens of thousands of troops, including Numidian cavalry and Iberian infantry, each with different dietary needs and equipment. Keeping them fed on campaign was challenging even on the plains, in the mountains it verged on impossible. Carthage could not supply him from the sea. He would have to live off the land, strike deals with tribes or take by force. The weight of elephants and baggage animals slowed his columns, forcing him to clear paths through rock and ice. Rome, by contrast, could draw on Italian harvests and established roads, but it faced the threat of having to fight multiple Carthaginian armies simultaneously if Hannibal's plan succeeded. This logistical asymmetry influenced the timing and risk calculations of both sides. Politics mattered as much as mountains. In Carthage, the Barcid family, led by Hannibal, championed an aggressive anti-Roman stance. Others, led by Hanno, argued for trade and diplomatic accommodation. Hannibal could not expect limitless reinforcements or funds, his strategy needed to be self-sustaining. Rome's Senate was divided between those who favored offensive action in Iberia and those who focused on homeland defense. The Roman alliance network depended on the perception of Roman invincibility. Any sign of weakness could encourage defection. Hannibal's plan sought to exploit this by demonstrating Rome's vulnerability. Time was critical. Hannibal needed to act before Rome consolidated its forces. If he lingered in Iberia or along the Rhone, Roman legions could block the Alpine passes or land troops in Spain. Winter approached. Crossing the Alps at the onset of snow risked avalanches and hypothermia, yet delaying meant facing more prepared Roman forces. Rome assumed the campaigning season ended when the snow began. Hannibal's decision to move during late autumn exploited this temporal blind spot. He accepted the danger of weather to gain the advantage of surprise. Morale and culture were intangible but powerful constraints. Hannibal commanded a polyglot army of Africans, Iberians, Celtiberians, and Numidians, each with its own loyalties and fears. Some were mercenaries, others were subjects. To keep them cohesive, he needed clear victories or at least a vision of eventual reward. Crossing mountains without fighting an enemy risked eroding their belief in his leadership. Rome's legions were citizen soldiers with a deep sense of duty. They believed in Roman superiority. However, their commanders had never fought elephants or faced an enemy from the north. Fear of the unknown could paralyze or provoke rashness. Hannibal's plan aimed to amplify that fear by confronting Roman troops with conditions they had never trained for. The blind spots of Rome extended beyond geography. The Senate trusted its intelligence networks, yet they underestimated Hannibal's capacity for long-range maneuver. Reports of his movements along the Rhone were dismissed or misinterpreted. Roman commanders assumed that if he advanced into Gaul he would spend months subduing tribes there. They did not imagine he would negotiate safe passage with some tribes, coerce others, and move on within days. Rome's own political system slowed its response. Consular armies operated on annual commands, and coordination between consuls was often tense. By the time they understood Hannibal's intent, they faced the dilemma of chasing him into the mountains or waiting for him on Italian soil. These constraints created a strategic deadlock. Hannibal could not win a naval war. Rome could not strike Carthage without leaving Italy exposed. The Alps appeared to make a direct land invasion of Italy impossible. Within that deadlock, Hannibal saw an opportunity. If he could cross the mountains quickly enough, he would emerge behind Roman lines with his army intact. The shock could fracture Rome's alliances and embolden its enemies. The gamble was clear. He was betting that the physical barrier would become his ally, not his tomb. And it is within these crushing constraints, geographical, logistical, political, and temporal, that a reversal of logic began to crystallize. Strategy is not created in a vacuum. Military treatises of the era, such as those later attributed to Roman tacticians, emphasized secure supply lines, interior lines of communication, and the avoidance of terrain that could not support baggage trains. A standard plan for Carthage, according to the manual, would be to contest the sea lanes, maintain strongholds in Iberia and North Africa, and engage Rome in battles of attrition on ground of their choosing. This approach relied on rebuilding the Carthaginian navy to challenge Roman dominance of the Mediterranean and on defending rather than invading. It assumed that Carthage could win by bleeding Rome's resources, not by striking at Rome's heart. Another conventional alternative was to march along the coastal route into Italy, hugging the Mediterranean where supply ships could shadow the army. This path kept the army within reach of water, food, and friendly ports. Why were these textbook options non-starters? First, the naval strategy was impossible in the timeframe Hannibal faced. Carthage's fleet had been smashed in the First Punic War. Its shipyards and finances could not immediately rebuild a navy capable of facing Rome's disciplined crews. Even if they attempted to rebuild, Rome had years of naval experience and had adapted the Corvus boarding device precisely to neutralize Carthaginian seafaring. A sea-borne invasion would have been intercepted and destroyed. Carthage simply did not have the time or the money to resurrect a fleet before Rome consolidated its positions in Iberia and Africa. Second, a defensive posture in Iberia or North Africa would concede the initiative. Rome, unthreatened at home, could choose when and where to attack. A siege of Carthage or the loss of Iberian territories would erode Barcid political capital at home. In strategic terms, waiting meant defeat. The coastal land route from Iberia into Italy, while superficially safer, was in practice a trap. The western Mediterranean coast was dotted with Roman allies and colonies, including Massilia, modern Marseille, which acted as a forward base for Roman naval patrols. An army hugging the shoreline would have to fight its way through fortified towns while its flanks were harried by Roman ships. Furthermore, the narrow coastal plain restricted maneuver. It prevented Hannibal from using his cavalry effectively. This path also offered Rome the possibility of cutting off Carthaginian rear echelons at several choke points. Conventional wisdom advised commanders to maintain continuous supply lines. This would have meant dragging a long train of wagons and animals that would slow movement and present targets for ambush. Another textbook option was to fight a series of set-piece battles in Spain, gradually wearing down Roman forces. However, the geography of Iberia favored guerrilla warfare. Hannibal's strengths lay in mobility and shock. Prolonged attrition would blunt his advantages and allow Rome to leverage its manpower reserves. In addition, Hanno's faction in Carthage opposed sending more resources to Spain. Hannibal needed a decisive and symbolic act to maintain support at home. A protracted Iberian campaign would be seen as indecision. For Rome, the textbook approach was clear: intercept Hannibal before he reached Italy or, failing that, block his entrance into the Italian plain. Roman doctrine emphasized roads, fortifications, and overwhelming force. They would mass their legions near the Alpine foothills and rely on the mountains to do the rest. This plan assumed that Hannibal would either be unable to cross the Alps or would arrive so weakened that a single decisive battle would finish him. The assumption freed Rome to wage war in multiple theaters, sending one army to Spain under Scipio and another to Africa if necessary. There was no serious contingency for a fully intact Carthaginian army materializing north of the Po. The limitations of textbook thinking become evident when viewed through the lens of Hannibal's problem. Every conventional strategy either ceded the initiative or played to Rome's strengths. The only approach that leveraged Carthaginian advantages was one that changed the entire geometry of the conflict. By crossing the Alps, Hannibal aimed to combine operational surprise with political impact. He intended to appear where he could recruit disaffected Gauls, cut Rome off from its northern allies, and fight on ground that neutralized the Roman navy. This choice violated the principle of maintaining secure supply lines, but it maximized psychological and strategic surprise. Why didn't other Carthaginian commanders attempt this before? Because it required discarding the comfort of doctrine. The mountains were labeled impassable for good reasons. They had claimed countless lives of traders and tribal groups. It demanded trust in untested alliances with Gaulish tribes. It meant believing that elephants could traverse narrow, icy paths without panicking and causing chaos. Most generals would prefer the known risks of a coastal campaign to the unknown perils of high passes. Hannibal's calculation was that the unknown risk offered the only path to victory. If he stayed within the manual, he would be contained, outflanked, and eventually defeated. If he broke the rules, he created a new game. In this way, Part 3 reveals the central conflict between established doctrine and situational adaptation. The proper way to fight had been codified by generations of warfare in temperate plains and Mediterranean seas. Hannibal faced a situation those rules did not contemplate: a strategic stalemate with a superior naval power and a need for decisive action. He chose to discard the manual, not out of recklessness, but because he had analyzed the available options and recognized that the conventional paths led to guaranteed defeat. Understanding this is crucial before moving on, because the next question is not, why did he do it, but, how did he convince his allies and subordinates to accept such an outrageous plan? Inside Carthage's council chambers and along the Rhone, how did this unorthodox decision come to life? Hannibal's decision did not emerge in a moment of inspiration. It was the result of months of planning and years of positioning. The Barcid family had built a power base in Iberia independent of the Carthaginian Senate. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, and brother-in-law Hasdrubal had expanded Carthaginian influence through conquest and diplomacy, creating a self-sufficient province rich in silver and manpower. When Rome intervened to protect the city of Saguntum, a Carthaginian ally south of the Ebro, it sparked the Second Punic War. Hannibal seized Saguntum after an 8-month siege, knowing this would force a confrontation with Rome. The initial phase of the war was still conventional. Roman armies moved to Spain and Sicily. Carthage fortified Africa. Only after assessing the balance of forces did Hannibal propose his radical plan. Inside the Carthaginian council, there were doubts. Hanno, representing the landed aristocracy, argued that war with Rome was folly. Even after hostilities began, he opposed sending reinforcements to Spain. Hannibal could count on support from the Barcid faction, which favored aggressive expansion, and from merchants who anticipated plunder. There is no surviving transcript of the debate. However, the political division is evident from the Senate's refusal to send significant aid during the Italian campaign. Hannibal effectively declared autonomy. He had to persuade his own officers and soldiers, many of whom had never seen the Alps, that the plan was both viable and necessary. He invoked the memory of his father's oath, taken years earlier before an altar, that he would hate Rome for all time. The campaign thus became a family cause and a national crusade. At the operational level, the decision required intelligence. Hannibal needed to know whether any pass through the Alps was negotiable. He sent scouts into Gaul disguised as merchants to learn the routes used by traders and shepherds. He cultivated relationships with tribes such as the Allobroges along the Rhone. He arranged for guides and hostages to secure passage through hostile areas. When he reached the Rhone, he faced his first test: how to transport tens of thousands of troops across a wide, fast river under the watch of hostile Gauls. Hannibal devised a simple but audacious solution. He built rafts using barrels and local timber, covered them with earth to fool animals into thinking they were crossing solid ground, and ferried horses and elephants across. He sent a detachment upstream to cross at night and attack the Gauls from behind, sowing confusion. This improvisation revealed how the unorthodox decision translated into inventive execution. The internal debate among Hannibal's officers focused on two questions: could the army survive the crossing, and what would happen if Rome blocked the other side? The first question hinged on a core assumption, that an army can overcome physical obstacles with determination and engineering. Hannibal believed that discipline and morale would carry his men through. He looked at historical examples. Celtic tribes had crossed the Alps in smaller groups. His father had crossed the Pyrenees with a large army. The second question involved intelligence on Roman dispositions. Hannibal assumed that Rome, expecting a coastal invasion, would not fortify the Alpine passes. He also assumed that the Gauls of the Po Valley, resentful of Roman dominance, would welcome him. If those assumptions proved wrong, his army would be trapped between mountains and Roman legions. The plan targeted multiple domains. It was first and foremost a psychological strike. By emerging in northern Italy unexpectedly, Hannibal sought to shock Rome's citizenry and political class. He wanted to demonstrate that Rome was vulnerable on its own soil, undermining the aura of invincibility. It was also a logistical maneuver. By avoiding the coastal route and the sea, he denied Rome's navy any role. It was an informational gambit. He masked his movements, used feints along the coast to tie down Roman forces, and spread rumors that he would not advance until spring. Finally, it was a time-based strategy. Crossing before winter meant braving snow but also catching Rome off guard. Each of these elements subverted standard practice. In a normal campaign, commanders sequence operations in phases. Hannibal compressed them into a single, continuous movement. Convincing others to follow required a narrative. Hannibal presented the Alps not as a barrier but as a gate to riches and revenge. He promised his soldiers that beyond the mountains lay fertile plains, ready for plunder, and allies ready to join them. He portrayed the hardships as a test of courage that would make them legends. He also used coercion. Some tribes demanded payment or hostages for safe passage. Hannibal paid when it suited him. When tribes betrayed him, he retaliated ruthlessly, using his war elephants to break through ambushes and leaving piles of bodies as warnings. This blend of persuasion and terror kept local resistance manageable. There were voices of dissent. Some officers feared the elephants would panic on narrow ledges, causing catastrophic avalanches. Others worried that supply lines could not be maintained through hundreds of miles of hostile territory. According to later Roman authors, there were even attempted mutinies. Hannibal addressed these by dividing his army into smaller columns, allowing them to move quickly and forage independently. He appointed trusted lieutenants such as Hannibal to command the cavalry and enforce discipline. He promised that any men who reached Italy would have a share of the spoils. Still, the risk was undeniable. He was staking everything on the belief that the Alps were not as impassable as Rome believed and that the reward justified the suffering. The unorthodox decision also rested on geopolitical calculations. Hannibal knew that the Celtic tribes of northern Italy had been subjugated by Rome in recent decades. They resented Roman colonies such as Placentia and Cremona. By appearing suddenly among them, Hannibal could ignite rebellion. He also hoped that other Italian allies, Samnites, Lucanians, Apulians, would see Rome's vulnerability and defect. This required demonstrating success quickly. If his army were delayed or decimated in the Alps, those potential allies would instead side with Rome. Hence, speed was essential. He could not afford to spend months on siegecraft or campaigning in Gaul. He had to reach the Po Valley before winter closed the passes entirely. Underlying all of this was a personal conviction. Hannibal is often portrayed as a gambler, but his gamble was analytical. He saw the strategic landscape and concluded that conventional methods would produce conventional outcomes, stalemate or defeat. The only path to altering the equation was to do something Rome considered impossible. This decision did not guarantee victory, but it created the possibility of altering the war's trajectory. The formation of this strategy thus combined geopolitical reading, psychological insight, tactical flexibility, and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk. The next question is how this concept became reality. Planning is one thing, marching elephants along icy ridges is another. The following section will examine the mechanics of execution, how the theoretical plan translated into action, where it nearly failed, and the razor's edge between triumph and catastrophe. How did Hannibal's army actually cross the Alps, and what hidden crises almost derailed them? Hannibal's strategy now moved from concept to execution. The first stage was to assemble the army in northern Spain and march to the Pyrenees. Moving tens of thousands of men through friendly territory was straightforward, the challenge was discipline. Different contingents had different traditions and leaders. Hannibal reorganized them into mixed units, pairing Iberians with Libyans, pairing veterans with recruits. This imposed mutual dependence and reduced the chance of desertion. He left garrisons behind to secure his lines of communication but carried most of his experienced troops forward. The Pyrenees crossing was a rehearsal for what lay ahead: steep, wooded passes, sudden ambushes by local tribes. Hannibal responded with swift counterattacks. He punished villages that resisted and rewarded those that provided guides. By the time he reached the Rhone Valley, he had shed some baggage and non-combatants, streamlining his force. Crossing the Rhone was the first major test. The river was wide, fast, and patrolled by the hostile Volsi tribe on the opposite bank. A frontal crossing would expose his men to missiles while they struggled against the current. Hannibal's solution was both tactical and psychological. He built rafts for the cavalry and elephants, as described earlier, but he also sent a detachment of Gaulish allies upriver to cross unnoticed at night. At dawn, as the main force began its crossing, the hidden detachment attacked the Volsi from behind, sowing panic and dispersing them. The river crossing succeeded with minimal losses. Hannibal then used wicker boats for the elephants. He placed earth on the boats to deceive the animals into thinking they were on solid ground. Some elephants panicked and fell into the water, but most made it across. This operation demonstrated the blend of planning and improvisation that defined his campaign. Once across the Rhone, Hannibal raced north to outpace Roman forces under Publius Scipio. Roman scouts, arriving too late, found only abandoned camps. The Carthaginian army then turned east toward the Alps. Here, geography imposed a new rhythm. The path narrowed, the weather chilled. The army entered the domain of mountain tribes who had no incentive to cooperate. Hannibal mitigated this by sending emissaries ahead with gifts and promises. Some tribes accepted and provided guides, others pretended to help only to prepare ambushes. The most dramatic of these occurred in a narrow gorge. Hannibal's vanguard was climbing when boulders began to tumble from above. Tribesmen descended on the baggage train. Chaos ensued. Hannibal responded by charging uphill with his heavy infantry and elephants, using the animals as living battering rams to clear the way. The attackers fled. The cost was heavy: men, horses, and supplies spilled into the chasms. But the army continued. The higher they climbed, the more inhospitable the landscape became. Trees thinned. Snow crusted the ground. Night brought freezing winds. Men and animals slipped on ice, pack animals carrying food fell and died. Hannibal's scouts searched for alternative routes. In one section, the path was blocked by a sheer cliff. Modern accounts say he used a combination of fire and vinegar to fracture rock, but whether this is literal or symbolic, he definitely engaged in engineering. His men cut away rock and packed earth to create a passable ledge. The elephants posed unique challenges. They could not negotiate narrow switchbacks. Hannibal widened paths by cutting into the slope. He ordered the army to build handrails of stakes and brush to give the beasts some sense of boundary. Each step required calculation. One misstep could send an elephant plummeting and cause a chain reaction. Supply was an omnipresent concern. Hannibal instructed his men to carry as much grain as they could on their backs. He dispatched foraging parties into adjacent valleys, but these expeditions risked getting lost or attacked. He rationed carefully. To maintain morale, he avoided cutting rations for the core fighting troops even when food was low. Firewood had to be scavenged under snow. Melting snow for water consumed time and fuel. Men died of exposure and exhaustion. Hannibal kept moving to prevent despair. When men collapsed, he urged them on by promising that each step downward would bring warmer climate and fertile lands. The psychological burden of watching comrades die without an enemy in sight was immense. Micro-twists threatened to unravel the campaign. At one point, guides misled the army onto a treacherous slope, perhaps intentionally. Night fell, snow obscured the path. Men wandered in circles. Panic spread. Hannibal personally took command of the vanguard, using torches and shouting to gather the lost. He reorganized columns, placing the most reliable troops at the front and back to prevent disintegration. Another crisis occurred when the army reached the summit only to find the descent worse than the ascent. The path was covered in ice, and the sheer drop frightened even the elephants. Hannibal paused for 2 days to let the animals rest and to clear a path. He had his men dig into the ice and lay straw to provide traction. During this halt, some tribes attacked his rear guard. He repelled them but lost more men and pack animals. Each of these incidents could have cascaded into disaster. They did not because Hannibal responded quickly and maintained cohesion. As the army began its descent into Italy, the landscape changed gradually from rock and ice to rolling forests. The weather eased. The men found berries, nuts, and small animals. For the first time in weeks, they could rest without freezing. However, the descent was not entirely safe. Cliffs loomed, and the trails were muddy and slippery. Horses and elephants struggled. In one incident, an elephant slipped and crashed into several soldiers, injuring and killing them. Hannibal is reported to have lost one of his eyes to an infection contracted during this period. His own suffering reinforced the shared ordeal. When they finally reached the plains near Turin, the army was depleted but intact. Estimates of their numbers vary, but it is clear that thousands had been lost. Those who remained had been forged into a hardened core. The logistical consequences were severe. Food stores were exhausted. Many horses were dead or lame. The surviving elephants were weakened, though their mere presence would later terrify Roman troops who had never seen such beasts. Hannibal needed to replenish quickly. He sought alliances with the Taurini and Insubres, offering gold and freedom from Roman taxes. Some accepted, others resisted and were subdued. He took their granaries and used their towns as temporary bases. He sent messages to Carthage and to his brother Hasdrubal in Spain requesting reinforcements, but he did not wait for them. The momentum of his arrival had to be exploited immediately. He gave his men a short respite and then marched toward the first Roman forces in Italy. The operational risks remained. Hannibal knew that if a Roman consular army trapped him before he replenished, he could be annihilated. Yet the very act of crossing the Alps had already influenced Rome. News of his arrival caused panic in the Senate. Roman legions in Spain under Gnaeus Scipio were too far away to help. Publius Scipio, returning from Gaul, tried to block Hannibal at the Ticinus River but was defeated. The next engagements at Trebia and Trasimene showed that the Alpine ordeal had not crippled Hannibal's fighting capacity. Instead, the survivors were seasoned, fiercely loyal, and hardened by extreme adversity. They followed an officer who had marched at their side, shared their dangers and delivered them into the enemy's homeland. In execution, Hannibal's strategy balanced speed with survival. He moved fast enough to keep ahead of Roman responses but slow enough to allow for engineering solutions. He displayed tactical flexibility at each obstacle, from the Rhone crossing to the avalanche ambush. He kept the army's morale focused on the promise of victory and vengeance. The rations, the injuries, the deaths, these were the prices paid to reshape the strategic map. At any number of points, a single misjudgment could have ended the campaign. But Hannibal's ability to improvise under pressure, combined with his understanding of the enemy's expectations, allowed him to bring his army into Italy largely intact. The next stage of the story shifts focus. With Hannibal now on the Italian plain, the initiative passed to Rome. How did the Roman Republic, confident in its system and legions, react to this unexpected invasion? What did Rome see, and what did it fail to see as Hannibal emerged from the mountains at its doorstep? When word reached Rome that Hannibal had appeared in northern Italy, the reaction was disbelief. The Senate had dispatched Publius Cornelius Scipio to intercept him in Gaul and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio to Spain. They expected Hannibal to be delayed or destroyed in the mountains. The news that he had arrived with elephants and cavalry intact challenged their assumptions. Nevertheless, Roman confidence remained high. The legions had not been defeated on Italian soil in generations. Heavy infantry formations, drilled to perfection, were thought capable of crushing any barbarian host. The Alps were supposed to be Rome's ally. Now Rome had to respond, but its response was shaped by doctrine and politics. The first encounter came at the river Ticinus. Publius Scipio, recently returned from Gaul, advanced with cavalry and light infantry, expecting to conduct reconnaissance in force. He underestimated the speed and cohesion of Hannibal's cavalry. Hannibal deployed his Numidian horsemen and Iberian lancers in a flexible formation. They swarmed around the Roman cavalry, feinted retreats, and then attacked from the flanks. Scipio's horse was wounded. He barely escaped with his life thanks to his son, who would later become Scipio Africanus. Rome misread the battle. They blamed the defeat on their cavalry being outnumbered, not on doctrinal rigidity. They did not recognize the tactical sophistication of Hannibal's mounted troops. This misinterpretation would recur. The next major engagement was at the Trebia River. The Roman consuls Tiberius Sempronius Longus and Publius Scipio disagreed on strategy. Scipio, recovering from his wounds, advised caution and waiting for reinforcements. Sempronius, eager for glory and influenced by political pressure, insisted on attacking immediately. Hannibal exploited the tension. He provoked Sempronius by sending his light infantry to harass Roman pickets, then withdrew across the freezing Trebia. Sempronius ordered his entire army to cross the river without breakfast, in winter, into waist-deep water. Roman soldiers emerged on the far bank cold and stiff. Hannibal's men were rested and had eaten. He positioned his Numidian cavalry on the wings, his heavy infantry in the center, and hid a detachment of Gauls and Numidians in the long grasses. When the Romans attacked, they were enveloped. The hidden troops struck their rear. The Roman formation broke. Thousands drowned in the Trebia as they tried to flee. Roman analyses blamed the weather and Sempronius' recklessness, not their failure to adapt tactics to a mobile enemy. Lake Trasimene was a masterclass in deception. Roman consul Gaius Flaminius pursued Hannibal through the hills of Etruria, believing he had trapped the Carthaginian army against the lake. Flaminius dismissed warnings of an ambush. Hannibal had chosen a narrow valley where mist from the lake often hung in the morning. He concealed infantry and cavalry on the hillsides and sent a small contingent to act as bait. Flaminius marched his legions into the valley, unaware that the enemy was above him. When the last Roman column entered, Hannibal signaled the attack. Warriors charged down both slopes, cutting off the front and rear. Panic ensued. Many Romans were killed or driven into the lake and drowned. Flaminius himself was cut down. In Rome, the defeat provoked a crisis. Yet official narratives stressed Flaminius' impetuousness and the treacherous fog, not Hannibal's ability to read terrain and conceal large forces. The Republic responded by appointing a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, but the lesson was still incomplete. Fabius Maximus proposed a strategy that broke with Roman tradition: avoid pitched battle with Hannibal and instead harass his foraging parties, burn supplies, and shadow him until he exhausted himself. This Fabian strategy was a partial recognition that Hannibal's mobility and tactical flexibility could not be beaten by frontal assault. It also acknowledged Rome's strategic depth. As long as Italy remained loyal, time was on Rome's side. But Fabius faced political backlash. Romans revered aggressive commanders. Senators and citizens derided him as the delayer. When his term ended, power returned to the consuls. In 216 BCE, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus took command. Varro, representing the popular party, promised to end the war quickly. Rome raised an unprecedented force of 8 legions. They intended to crush Hannibal in a single blow at Cannae. Hannibal anticipated their eagerness. He deployed his troops in a convex formation, placing his weakest Gauls in the center, his African veterans on the wings, and his cavalry on the flanks. As the Roman mass pressed the center, Hannibal's line gradually bent into a concave pocket. His cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry, then attacked the Roman infantry from behind. The trap closed. Nearly the entire Roman army was annihilated. Varro fled, Paulus died. Rome had again interpreted Hannibal through its own doctrine. They saw him as an enemy to be overpowered by mass and discipline, not as a strategist who used terrain and psychology. Their misinterpretation cost tens of thousands of lives. What were the underlying reasons for these misreads? First, cognitive biases. Roman commanders were products of a system that rewarded aggression. Their experience taught them that courage and discipline overcome cunning. They were slow to imagine an enemy who used deception as his primary weapon. Second, organizational rigidity. Rome's consular system meant two commanders alternated command daily. Divergent personalities could not execute a unified, adaptive plan. Hannibal, by contrast, had unity of command. Third, information asymmetry. Rome relied on scouts and reports from allies. These networks were disrupted as Gaulish and Italian tribes defected. Hannibal spread false intelligence, planted rumors, and used quick movements to confuse observers. Fourth, doctrinal inertia. Roman training emphasized heavy infantry in close order. They excelled on open terrain against conventional opponents. They did not adapt quickly to combined arms tactics involving light infantry, cavalry, and ambushes. Even after Trebia and Trasimene, they continued to seek decisive engagements. This does not mean Rome learned nothing. After Cannae, there was widespread fear that Hannibal would march on the city. He did not. He lacked siege equipment and hoped Rome's allies would revolt. When most did not, he realized that victories on the battlefield were not translating into strategic collapse. Rome, stunned but defiant, enacted reforms. They adopted Fabian tactics more consistently, harassed Carthaginian foragers, and refused pitched battle. They restructured their cavalry to improve flexibility. They appointed skilled commanders like Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who won the nickname, the Sword of Rome, for his aggressive yet cautious actions. Eventually, under the younger Scipio, Rome would take the fight back to Spain and Africa, exploiting Carthage's own vulnerabilities. Nevertheless, the early Roman reactions demonstrate how an opponent can fall into a trap of its own making. Hannibal did not simply outfight his enemies, he exploited their assumptions. He understood Roman pride and political pressures. He provoked impatience. Each early battle was not just a tactical victory but a psychological blow that made Rome question its methods. Yet Rome misattributed its failures to individual commanders rather than systemic factors. Only when it recognized that the problem lay in its own doctrine and structure did it begin to adapt. The story of these misinterpretations sets the stage for the next part of our narrative, the culmination of Hannibal's Italian campaign, the eventual shift of momentum, and the immense costs incurred by both sides. How did these decisions lead to the war's turning point, and what price did Hannibal and Rome pay for their respective strategies? Hannibal's early victories had shaken Rome but not broken it. After Cannae, the Roman Senate refused to negotiate. They enacted a policy that each citizen must swear never to consider peace while a foreign enemy remained in Italy. They rebuilt their armies, sometimes by freeing slaves and recruiting criminals, a measure that showed desperation. Hannibal, meanwhile, expected Rome's Italian allies to defect en masse. Some did. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates. Cities in Apulia and Lucania declared for Carthage. Yet the majority of Rome's allies stayed loyal. The strategy of shocking Italy into revolt succeeded only partially. Hannibal found himself managing a patchwork of allies while facing a revitalized Rome. The war in Italy descended into a stalemate. Hannibal's army raided and foraged but could not besiege Rome itself. He lacked siege engines and manpower. Carthage sent little support. Hasdrubal's reinforcement from Spain was delayed by Roman resistance and eventually defeated at the Metaurus River. Without additional troops, Hannibal had to husband his forces. Rome adopted Fabian tactics, avoiding large engagements and attacking his allies. Marcus Claudius Marcellus captured Syracuse and recovered many southern cities. Scipio Africanus, campaigning in Spain, cut off Carthaginian supply lines and destroyed their Iberian army. Rome's strategic adaptation eroded Hannibal's position. By 203 BCE, after more than a decade in Italy, Hannibal was ordered back to Africa to defend Carthage itself. The final act came at Zama. Hannibal and Scipio met in 202 BCE on the plains of North Africa. Hannibal assembled a new army, including veterans from Italy and levies from Numidian allies. Scipio had Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, who had defected from Carthage. Hannibal used his war elephants at the outset, but Scipio prepared gaps in his lines to let them pass through. Roman and Numidian cavalry routed their Carthaginian counterparts and returned to strike Hannibal's infantry from the rear. Hannibal's veterans fought fiercely but were encircled and crushed. For the first and last time, Hannibal's own army was decisively defeated in open battle. He advised Carthage to sue for peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage had to surrender its fleet, pay indemnities, and could not wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal's strategic gamble had ultimately failed to secure victory, though it had come close to a pending Roman power. The human cost of this strategy was staggering. Thousands of Hannibal's soldiers perished in the Alps and on Italian battlefields. The precise number is debated, but entire contingents, including most of his elephants, were lost in transit or in battle. Gaulish and Italian allies suffered reprisals from Rome after they supported Hannibal. In Rome, the role of citizens eligible for military service dropped sharply. At Cannae alone, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died or went missing. Families were decimated. Consular armies were annihilated. The psychological trauma was profound. Romans feared that their city would fall. Hannibal's soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning abroad, returned to Carthage to find a politically weakened homeland. Many were discharged without compensation. Veterans drifted into mercenary service or banditry. The logistical cost also strained both states. Hannibal's march burned through equipment and animals that could not be replaced. Carthage spent treasure recruiting and maintaining an army far from home. The long Italian campaign disrupted trade and agriculture in southern Italy. Rome taxed its allies heavily to fund constant levies. Fields were abandoned, towns fortified. Both economies reeled. Politically, the war reshaped both republics. Carthage's oligarchs turned against the Barcids. Hannibal eventually entered politics and enacted reforms but faced accusations and exile. He fled to the courts of Eastern kings and ultimately committed suicide rather than be handed over to Rome. Rome, emboldened by victory, adopted a more imperial posture. They saw the danger of any rival naval power and later destroyed Carthage completely in the Third Punic War. The psychological price for leaders was significant. Hannibal carried the burden of being both a national hero and a scapegoat. He had won unmatched victories yet could not capitalize on them. He saw the deaths of brothers and friends and the destruction of the cause he had championed. He spent his later years advising foreign courts on how to resist Rome, a role that underscores his continued strategic brilliance but also his exile. Roman commanders faced their own crises. Scipio Africanus, hailed as the savior of Rome, later faced accusations of corruption and withdrew from public life. Fabius Maximus was ridiculed during his dictatorship, only to be celebrated posthumously as the man who saved Rome through delay. The war left a legacy of distrust between Rome and its allies. Cities like Capua and Tarentum that had defected were punished severely, their elites executed or enslaved. Assessing the outcome of Hannibal's strategy depends on the lens used. Tactically, he was brilliant. He inflicted defeats that are still studied. Strategically, he shifted the war to Italy and forced Rome into a defensive posture. Psychologically, he revealed Rome's vulnerability and the limitations of its doctrine. Politically, however, his strategy failed to achieve the intended decisive result. Rome's resilience, adaptive learning, and deep manpower reserves overwhelmed Carthage's bold gambit. The cost for Carthage was the loss of its empire, its navy, and eventually its independence. The cost for Rome was enormous casualties, devastated countryside, and the long-term moral erosion that comes from prolonged war. Yet Rome emerged as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. In closing this section, the price of Hannibal's strategy is best understood not just in numbers but in transformations. It reshaped the Roman military system, leading to reforms that would later enable empire. It forced Carthage into a corner, weakening it irreparably. It produced legends of courage and cruelty, of elephants on icy ridges and legions annihilated in foggy valleys. It showed that even the most audacious strategy cannot compensate indefinitely for structural disadvantages. The next and final section will look beyond the immediate outcome. We will extract the broader strategic lessons from this episode, what principles can be learned about surprise, adaptation, and the limits of audacity. What can modern strategists glean from Hannibal's gamble, and how do we separate mythology from enduring insight? To decode Hannibal's Alpine gamble, we must separate myth from mechanism. The story of elephants on snow-capped ridges is dramatic, but the strategic essence lies elsewhere. At its core, Hannibal's plan was about redefining the geometry of conflict. He neutralized Rome's naval superiority by operating entirely on land. He transformed a natural barrier into a conduit. He forced the enemy to fight on multiple fronts and in unfamiliar ways. This was not random audacity, it was a calculated breach of doctrine, executed with disciplined improvisation. From this emerge several principles that transcend the specific context. The first principle is strategic asymmetry. When facing a stronger opponent, do not mirror their strengths. Rome's advantages were its navy, its manpower, and its system of fortifications. Hannibal refused to contest these head-on. He moved where Rome thought it was safe, creating a new theater. This principle recurs in history. During World War II, Allied planners used Operation Mincemeat to mislead German forces about the invasion site, exploiting German assumptions about Allied intentions. In the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian forces used water cannons to cut through the Bar-Lev line, turning a defensive barrier into an advantage. In each case, commanders identified an area where the enemy felt secure and attacked there, forcing a recalibration of the entire conflict. However, asymmetry is not a magic trick. It requires deep understanding of the opponent's thinking and careful orchestration of resources. Hannibal did not simply decide to cross the Alps, he prepared alliances, gathered intelligence, and synchronized his movements with events in Iberia and Africa. The second principle concerns psychological operations. War is fought not only with weapons but with perceptions. Hannibal's march was designed to shock Rome's allies into reconsidering their loyalties. His use of elephants, while tactically limited after the crossing, had enormous symbolic impact. Roman soldiers had never faced such creatures. Stories of the Carthaginian army's endurance spread fear and admiration. Later, during the Korean War, General MacArthur's amphibious assault at Incheon exploited North Korean complacency. It involved navigating tides and narrow channels, but its psychological effect was decisive. It forced the North Korean army to retreat in disarray. Psychological pressure can cause an opponent to overreact or freeze. Yet it is a double-edged sword. Hannibal's psychological gambits did not produce the mass defections he anticipated. The principle, therefore, is to align psychological operations with realistic expectations and follow them with tangible gains. A third principle is adaptive logistics. The logistics of crossing the Alps were not solved by brute force but by innovation, building rafts, widening paths, dividing the army to forage, negotiating with local tribes. This capacity to adapt allowed Hannibal to transform an impossible idea into a feasible plan. Logistics often constrain strategy. Many bold ideas falter because they disregard supply, terrain, or weather. Hannibal's success in the mountains was followed by logistical failure in Italy. His supply lines were overstretched, and Carthage failed to send reinforcements. Similarly, Julius Caesar's double-wall strategy at Alesia involved constructing 20 miles of fortifications facing both inward and outward. It was audacious, but it worked because Caesar controlled engineering units, labor, and supply lines. Adaptive logistics require leaders to anticipate obstacles and empower subordinates to solve problems on the fly. The fourth principle is unity of command and narrative. Hannibal commanded his army with autonomy. He could make rapid decisions without waiting for approval from Carthage. He also provided his soldiers with a narrative. They were avenging past humiliations and liberating people from Roman dominance. This unity allowed him to maintain cohesion among diverse troops. Rome's early failures were exacerbated by split command and conflicting strategies. In modern conflicts, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, unified command structures and coherent narratives have proven critical. However, unity must be paired with adaptability. Hannibal's narrative eventually faltered when promised revolts did not materialize. Maintaining a narrative over long wars is challenging, it must evolve with circumstances. From these principles, we can extract more nuanced lessons. Risk management is central. Hannibal accepted immense risk. He could have lost his entire army in the Alps. The decision was not reckless because he calculated that the alternative, facing Rome on conventional terms, offered little chance of success. Risk in strategy is not avoided but balanced against reward. Commanders must ask, what happens if I fail? Can I survive? Hannibal's failure to secure adequate support from Carthage meant he lacked a safety net. The lesson is that audacity must be backed by systems that can exploit success and absorb failure. Timing is another lesson. Hannibal struck at a moment when Rome was engaged on multiple fronts and before the Italian alliance could be reinforced. Timing magnifies the effect of surprise. Modern operations, such as Israel's Operation Entebbe, show that precise timing can compensate for small numbers and long distances. But timing also interacts with other factors: weather, enemy cycles, political calendars. Misjudging timing can turn a bold plan into a disaster. Finally, we must address limits. Hannibal's strategy reveals that even the most brilliant maneuvers cannot overcome structural disadvantages indefinitely. Carthage could not sustain a long war far from home. Rome's population and resource base were larger, its political system could survive defeats and adapt. The lesson is that strategy must align with grand strategy. Tactical brilliance cannot substitute for strategic sustainability. This insight echoes across history. The German Blitzkrieg in 1940 achieved stunning tactical victories but ultimately failed due to lack of long-term economic and logistical capacity. Understanding these limits is crucial in evaluating unorthodox strategies. They can change the course of a war in the short term but must be integrated into a broader plan that addresses resource mobilization, alliance management, and political objectives.